Hey there, dear friend. Before we begin our quiet journey to explore what it was really like to be a gladiator in ancient Rome, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. If you enjoy these gentle walks through the past, feel free to leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from, and perhaps subscribe so you can drift back with us again. Behind the myth of the superstar warrior was a far more complicated, often quiet reality. So let's drift back now to sun-baked stone and the distant roar of a crowd. Imagine the warm air carrying 1,000 competing scents. There's the sweetness of baked bread from a corner pistrinum, the sharp tang of cheap wine spilled on the cobblestones, the earthy smell of dust and animals, and underneath it all, a faint, metallic note you can't quite place. This is Rome. Not the Rome of pristine marble statues you see in museums, but a living, breathing, noisy city of over 1 million souls packed tightly together. And somewhere in this sprawling metropolis, somewhere beyond the gossiping senators and the clattering carts, is the world we are going to visit tonight. It's a world that exists in the shadow of the great monuments, a place of discipline, sweat, and quiet desperation. It is the world of the gladiator. Before we step into the arena, or even the training yard, let's just feel the pulse of the city that created such a spectacle. The sun is high and white in the sky, beating down on the terracotta tiles and the crowded, narrow streets of the Subura district. You can hear the constant murmur of Latin, 100 different accents from across the vast empire, all mingling together. A merchant hawking his wares, the laughter of children playing a game with knuckle bones, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby workshop. It's a city of immense power and wealth, but also of profound inequality. For every patrician lounging in his cool, shaded villa, there are 1,000 people living in rickety, multi-story apartment blocks called insulae, where life is precarious and the threat of fire or collapse is ever present. And it is this city, this massive, hungry, glorious, and brutal organism that demands entertainment. It craves a spectacle powerful enough to make it forget its troubles, to reinforce its sense of identity, its sense of Romanness. The gladiator is an answer to that craving. He is a paradox, a figure both reviled and revered. He is a slave, a piece of property, often a condemned criminal or a prisoner of war, his life worth only as much as the ticket sales he can generate. And yet, he is also a celebrity. His image is scratched onto walls as graffiti, his likeness molded into oil lamps and pottery. Poets write about his strength, and wealthy matrons are said to swoon for him, paying fortunes for a night with a champion. He is the ultimate outsider, and yet he is at the very center of Roman identity. He represents controlled violence, the subjugation of Rome's enemies, and the stoic ideal of facing death with courage. But that is the myth, the public image. The reality, as we are about to discover, is something far quieter, far grittier, and infinitely more human. The reality begins not with the roar of the crowd, but with the crunch of gravel under a guard's boot, the taste of barley porridge, and the constant, aching soreness in your muscles. It begins in a place called the ludus, the gladiator school. And from the outside, it doesn't look like a place of legends. It looks like a fortress, a prison, high walls, a single, heavily guarded gate. From here, you can't hear the city anymore. The sounds are different. The rhythmic thud of wooden swords hitting shields, the grunts of exertion, the sharp commands of a trainer. The air smells of sweat, oiled leather, and something else, a faint, ever-present scent of fear. So let's leave the bustling streets behind for now. Let's push open that heavy gate and step inside into the quiet discipline of the courtyard and begin to understand the world, not of the superstar, but of the man whose life was a long, slow walk towards a single afternoon in the sun. The idea of men fighting to the death for public entertainment didn't just appear out of nowhere, springing fully formed from the mind of some spectacle-hungry emperor. Like most things in Rome, its roots are deeper, tangled in the soil of tradition, religion, and the very specific Roman relationship with death. To find the source, we have to drift back even further, before the Colosseum, before the Caesars, to a time when Rome was still just a rising power on the Italian peninsula, jostling for space with its neighbors. And one of its most influential neighbors was the Etruscans, a mysterious and sophisticated people who dominated central Italy before the Romans. The Etruscans practiced elaborate funeral rites, and some of their tomb paintings depict armed men engaged in combat, seemingly as part of the ceremony. This wasn't entertainment, as the later Romans would understand it. This was a form of ritual sacrifice, a blood offering to honor the spirit of a deceased aristocrat. The belief was that the life force, the anima, of the fallen warrior would accompany the soul of the dead nobleman into the afterlife, serving him as a guard or attendant. It was a solemn, religious duty, a munus, which in Latin means a duty, an obligation, but also a gift of blood to the dead. The first recorded gladiatorial combat in Rome itself took place in 264 BCE, and it followed this older tradition precisely. Two sons of a prominent man named Junius Brutus Para staged a fight between three pairs of gladiators in the city's cattle market to honor their deceased father. Imagine that scene. It's not a grand amphitheater. There are no cheering crowds, no vendors selling snacks. It's an open market square, perhaps cleared for the occasion. The mood is somber, respectful. The family of the deceased is there, dressed in mourning. The combatants are likely slaves, their lives considered forfeit, a final, bloody tribute to their master. The fight is brutal and probably short. There's no complex scoring, no referee looking for a sign of surrender. The purpose is death and the spilling of blood on the earth to appease the spirits of the underworld. For over a century, this is how it remained. A private affair, a duty of the wealthy elite to their dead ancestors. The games, the munera, were held infrequently, always tied to the funeral of a great man. But slowly, something began to shift. The Roman mind, so practical and attuned to the mechanics of power, saw a secondary benefit. These funeral games drew a crowd. People were fascinated. The spectacle of life and death combat, even in a solemn context, was undeniably compelling. Ambitious politicians began to notice. Staging a particularly grand munus for a deceased relative was a way to display your family's wealth and piety. It was also a fantastic way to win public favor, so the games began to grow. First, a few dozen pairs of gladiators, then 100. The religious pretext, the honoring of the dead, started to become thinner, more of an excuse than a reason. The original somber atmosphere began to be replaced by a sense of public festival. By the late Republic, figures like Julius Caesar were staging games on an unprecedented scale, ostensibly for his long-dead father and daughter, but in reality, as a massive act of public relations, a way of cementing his popularity with the Roman people. The munus had transformed. The gift was no longer for the dead. It was for the living. The solemn duty had become a political tool, a form of mass entertainment designed to pacify and distract the populace. This is the famous concept of bread in circuses, panem et circenses, a phrase coined later by the satirist Juvenal, but a reality long before he ever wrote it. The state recognized the immense power of the arena. Give the people cheap food and spectacular, violent entertainment, and they would be less likely to notice the erosion of their political freedoms or the staggering corruption of the ruling class. So, the emperors took over. What was once a private family obligation became a state-sponsored spectacle. Grand amphitheaters, like the magnificent Colosseum, were built specifically for this purpose. The games were no longer just tied to funerals. They celebrated military victories, imperial birthdays, the dedication of a new temple. They became a regular and central part of Roman life. The gladiator, who began as a sacrificial victim in a religious rite, was now a professional entertainer, an athlete trained for a blood sport that served the political needs of the empire. But that original connection to death, to ritual, never entirely faded away. It lingered in the background, in the superstitions of the fighters, in the quasi-religious paraphernalia of the games, and in the profound seriousness with which the Romans regarded the spectacle. They weren't just watching a sport. They were watching a ritualized drama about life, death, courage, and fate. And in doing so, they were reaffirming their own sense of order and power over a chaotic world. The man fighting on the sand was a living embodiment of Rome's dominion over its enemies. He was a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice, a life given for the pleasure and security of the Roman people. It's a strange and quiet irony. The tradition began as a way to serve the dead, and it evolved into a way to control the living. So, where did these men come from? Who populates the cold barracks of the ludus, and eventually, the hot sand of the arena? The popular image, fueled by heroic films and novels, is of a noble hero, wrongfully enslaved, or a rebellious warrior, choosing a life of defiant combat. And while there were indeed a handful of free men, volunteers who chose this life for fame or to escape debt, they were the tiny, exceptional minority. For the vast majority, the journey to the arena began not with a choice, but with a chain. The single largest source of gladiators was prisoners of war. Imagine you are a tribesman in Gaul, or a warrior in Dacia, or a fighter from a Germanic tribe on the Rhine frontier. You have spent your life defending your home, your family, your way of life against the relentless expansion of the Roman legions. But in the end, the discipline and organization of the Roman army proved too much. Your village is burned, your king is dead, and you are captured. You are marched for weeks, chained to dozens of other men, across lands you do not know. You don't speak the language. You are stripped of your name, your identity, your past. You are no longer a farmer or a warrior with a family and a history. You are simply captivus, a captive, a piece of war booty. You might be sent to work in the mines, a virtual death sentence, or on a large agricultural estate, a latifundium. Or, if you are young, strong, and show a flicker of fighting spirit, you might catch the eye of a slave trader who works for a lanista, the owner of a gladiator school. You are inspected like an animal. Your teeth are checked, your muscles squeezed, your joints tested. The lanista is making a cold, hard business calculation. Is this man a good investment? Can he be trained? Can he survive long enough to fight in the arena and earn back his purchase price, and then some? If the answer is yes, a deal is struck. Money changes hands. You now belong to the ludus. You have a new owner and a new, terrible purpose. Another major source was criminals. Roman justice was swift and brutal, especially for the lower classes. For serious crimes, murder, banditry, arson, rebellion, the sentence was often damnatio ad ludum, condemnation to the gladiator school. This was considered a step up from the other common sentence, damnatio ad bestias, being thrown to wild animals with no weapon and no chance. If you were condemned ad ludum, you were essentially given a temporary stay of execution. You would be trained to fight, and for as long as you could survive in the arena, you lived, but your life was forfeit. You were expected to die, eventually, for the entertainment of the Roman people. You were, in the stark legal terms of the time, a dead man walking. Your legal rights were extinguished. You could not own property. You could not make a will. You were a thing, a tool for the games. And then there were the slaves, not just prisoners of war, but any slave who was disobedient, rebellious, or simply unlucky. A master who was cruel or in debt might sell a strong but difficult slave to a lanista. It was a way of getting rid of a problem and making a profit at the same time. The slave might be branded, often on the face, with a stigma, a permanent mark of his status that would follow him forever, even if he were to one day, miraculously, win his freedom. Finally, we have that small, curious group, the volunteers, the octorati. These were free Roman citizens who, for various reasons, signed a contract to become a gladiator. Why would anyone do this? Usually, it came down to desperation. A man might be crushed by debt, with no other way to support his family. By signing the octoramentum, he would receive a large signing bonus, enough to clear his name. Others were perhaps former soldiers who couldn't adjust to civilian life, craving the thrill and structure of combat. And a very few, were likely driven by a thirst for glory, a desire to become one of the arena's superstars, adored by the crowds. But in signing that contract, they willingly surrendered their freedom. They swore an oath to their lanista, pledging to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. For the duration of their contract, they were, for all intents and purposes, slaves. They lived under the same harsh discipline, ate the same food, and faced the same risk of a violent death as the prisoner of war next to them. So, as you look around the training yard of the ludus, you see a strange and tragic assortment of humanity. A blonde-haired German giant who still dreams of the dark forests of his homeland. A wiry, dark-eyed Syrian who was once a desert bandit. A Roman citizen who lost everything on a bad bet. A grizzled veteran of the legions with nothing left to lose. They come from every corner of the vast empire, a mosaic of broken lives and lost futures. They do not speak the same languages. They do not worship the same gods. The only things they have in common are the chains that brought them here and the sword they are now being taught to wield. Their pasts have been erased. Their future is a single, bloody point on the horizon, the arena. And the man who owns them all, the lanista, sees them not as men, but as inventory. Each one has a price tag. Each one represents a potential profit or a devastating loss. His job is to manage this high-risk portfolio of human life, to train and feed and heal them just enough to get them into the ring, where their true value will finally be decided. Your arrival at the ludus is an assault on the senses. The heavy wooden gate groans shut behind you, and the chaotic, vibrant noise of the Roman street is instantly replaced by a different, more focused set of sounds. The rhythmic clang of metal on wood, the grunts of men pushing their bodies to the limit, the sharp, barked commands of the trainers, the doctors. The air itself feels different. It's thick with the smells of hard human effort, stale sweat, dust, and the metallic tang of blood. But there are other scents layered underneath. There's the aroma of hot oil used to rub down muscles, the sharp, medicinal smell of poultices and herbs from the infirmary, and the faint, earthy scent of the barley and beans that will become your staple diet. It's a place that smells of pain and preparation. The ludus is built for purpose, not comfort. It's a self-contained world, a combination of a military barracks, a prison, and a high-performance athletic facility. In the center is a large, open-air courtyard, its ground covered in sand, mimicking the floor of the arena. This is the heart of the school, where the training happens from dawn until dusk. Surrounding the courtyard are the functional buildings. There's a block of small, cell-like rooms for the gladiators, a kitchen, an armory, and an infirmary that is, paradoxically, one of the best-equipped medical facilities you might find in the ancient world. The entire complex is enclosed by high, unforgiving walls. There is only one way in or out, and it is always guarded. You are not a student here. You are an inmate. Your first stop is an inspection. You are stripped naked and brought before the lanista and his chief trainer, the doctor. This is not a moment of welcome, but of cold appraisal. They are assessing their new property. They look at your physique, your height, your reach. They are looking for strength, agility, and any old injuries or weaknesses that might make you a poor investment. They might have you perform a few basic movements, a lunge, a swing of a weighted club, to gauge your natural aptitude. A physician, the medicus, will also examine you. He checks your teeth, your eyes, the way you breathe. He is looking for signs of disease or underlying conditions that could fell you before you ever set foot in the arena. It's a deeply humiliating experience, being prodded and examined like a piece of livestock. But for the lanista, it's just business. He is deciding your fate, what kind of gladiator you will become. Based on your body type and aptitude, you will be assigned a specialty. Are you large and powerful? You might be destined to become a murmillo, a heavily armed fighter. Are you quick and slender? Perhaps a retiarius, the lightly armed net and trident fighter who relies on speed. This decision is crucial. It will determine your weapons, your armor, your fighting style, and very likely, your chances of survival. You are then assigned your place in the barracks. The cells are small and Spartan. A straw mattress on a wooden bunk, perhaps a rough woolen blanket. There is no privacy. You share this space with other men, strangers from different lands, all trapped in the same predicament. You might be paired with a more experienced gladiator, a veteran of the sands, who is tasked with teaching you the unspoken rules of the ludus. The hierarchy here is strict. At the top is the lanista, the owner. He is often a man from a lower social class who has become wealthy through this brutal trade. He is respected for his business acumen, but also socially despised. He is a dealer in death, a purveyor of human suffering, and polite Roman society looks down on him, even as they flock to his games. Beneath him are the doctors, the trainers. These are often successful ex-gladiators who have won their freedom and chosen to stay in the only world they know. They are hard, unforgiving men. They know that a lapse in training, a moment of weakness, will mean death in the arena, so their methods are brutal and relentless. They carry a whip or a rod, and they do not hesitate to use it. And then there are the gladiators themselves, ranked in a complex pecking order. The established champions, the primi pali. First swords. Get the best treatment, better food, better quarters, certain privileges. They are the school's star assets. Then come the seasoned fighters, the secundi pali, and so on, all the way down to you, the novice, the tiro. You are at the very bottom. You must prove yourself. You are given your first set of training gear. It's not the gleaming steel you will one day wear in the arena. Instead, you are handed a rudis, a wooden sword that is deliberately much heavier than a real gladius. You are also given a practice shield made of wicker or wood, also oversized and heavy. The principle is simple and cruel. If you can train for hours with this heavy, clumsy equipment, the real armor and weapons will feel light and nimble in your hands. The first few days are a blur of pain. Every muscle in your body screams in protest. You are woken before dawn, put through grueling drills, and fed a monotonous, starchy diet. The discipline is absolute. Any infraction, any sign of laziness or disobedience is met with a swift and painful punishment. This isn't about building character. It's about breaking you down and rebuilding you into something new, something that can function in the kill or be killed environment of the arena. It's a process of dehumanization. Your old life is gone. Your new life is this yard, this wooden sword, this constant exhaustion. The only goal is to survive today's training and then tomorrow's. And through it all, there is the quiet, ever-present knowledge of where this is all leading. Every drill, every sore muscle, every meal of barley mush is a step on the path to the amphitheater, to that moment when the gate will open and you will walk out onto the sand, to the roar of a crowd that has come to see you live or die. The engine that fuels the gladiator's body is not a gourmet feast. It is a calculated, monotonous, and highly effective diet designed for one purpose: to build bulk and endurance. The Romans, with their typical practicality, understood that a certain type of physique was best suited for the arena. Lean, ripped muscles, like those of a modern bodybuilder, were not the ideal. A layer of fat over the muscle was actually desirable. It provided a cushion against cuts and slashes, protecting the underlying muscles and vital organs from minor wounds. A superficial cut that bled spectacularly, but didn't cause serious damage, was great for the show. And a layer of subcutaneous fat made that more likely. A fighter who was too lean could be taken out of a fight by a relatively minor injury. So the goal was not to be shredded, it was to be sturdy. The gladiators were famously known as hordiri, which literally translates to barley men. This was their core food staple. Barley, a cheap and plentiful grain, formed the basis of almost every meal. It was usually served as a thick porridge or a dense, heavy bread. It's a food that is incredibly high in carbohydrates, perfect for providing the slow-release energy needed for hours of intense physical training. Imagine eating the same lumpy, bland, grayish mush day after day. It's not the food of a hero. It's fuel, pure and simple. Alongside the barley, the diet was supplemented with legumes, beans, lentils, and peas. These provided the necessary protein for muscle repair and growth. Again, it's about function, not flavor. A stew of beans and barley might be the main meal of the day, every day. There was very little meat. Meat was expensive and considered a luxury. The diet of a gladiator was almost entirely vegetarian, a fact confirmed by modern archaeological studies of gladiator burial sites. Analysis of the bones of gladiators has shown high levels of strontium, an element found in abundance in plants like barley, and low levels of zinc, which is associated with a meat-heavy diet. So the image of the gladiator tearing into a haunch of roasted meat is largely a fantasy. The reality was far more like a very strict, very boring vegan carb-loading regimen. But the Romans were sophisticated nutritionists in their own way. They recognized that this limited diet might be lacking in certain essential minerals. The same bone analysis has revealed something fascinating. Gladiators had unusually high levels of calcium. Where did this come from? The historical texts give us a clue. They mention that gladiators drank a concoction made of wood or bone ash, mixed with water or vinegar. It sounds disgusting, a gritty, foul-tasting brew. But this ash was a rich source of calcium. The Romans knew, through observation, that strong bones were essential to withstand the rigors of combat and training. A broken bone could end a career and a life. So they supplemented their diet with this strange, medicinal ash drink to fortify their skeletons. It's a perfect example of the Roman approach. Brutally practical, scientifically astute in its own way, and utterly devoid of comfort or pleasure. It's like a modern athlete, meticulously managing their macros and supplements, but stripped of all the fancy packaging and flavor options. There is no choice. You eat what you are given. You drink the ash-laced water. You do it because your survival depends on it. The food is part of the discipline, another aspect of your life that is completely controlled by the lanista. He is investing in you, feeding his asset in the most cost-effective way possible. He needs you to be strong, resilient, and to have a body that can take punishment. He doesn't need you to be happy. This diet also had a psychological effect. The monotony, the lack of variety, was just one more way of breaking down your individuality. You are what you eat, and you eat the same fuel as every other man in the ludus. It reinforces the idea that you are no longer a person with preferences and tastes, but a cog in a machine, a body being prepared for a specific task. And yet, there were moments of exception. The most famous was the cena libera, the free dinner, held the night before a gladiator was scheduled to fight in the games. This was a public banquet. The fighters who were to appear the next day were given a lavish, multi-course meal, full of all the things their normal diet lacked. Roasted meats, rich sauces, fine wine, fruit. But this was not an act of kindness. It was part of the spectacle. The public was often invited to come and watch the gladiators eat. It was a chance to see the combatants up close, to inspect them, to choose a favorite to bet on. Imagine the strange, surreal atmosphere of that meal. You are eating the best food you've had in months, perhaps years. But you are on display, being watched like an animal in a zoo, and every bite is shadowed by the knowledge of what awaits you at dawn. Is this meal a final, decadent pleasure? Or is it more like the final fattening of a beast before the slaughter? For the gladiator, it was likely a confusing mix of both. A moment of sensory indulgence overshadowed by a deep, cold dread. It was a reminder that even in a moment of apparent luxury, you were still just a part of the show. Your life, and even your last meal, belonged to the crowd. The training begins before the sun has fully risen. You are roused from your straw mattress in the pre-dawn chill, the air still cool and damp. There's no gentle waking up. A guard bangs on the cell door, and you are expected to be on your feet, ready within moments. The first part of the day is dedicated to conditioning. This isn't about fancy swordplay. It's about building the raw physical foundation required to survive. You run laps around the courtyard until your lungs burn. You do calisthenics, pushing, pulling, lifting, You might be made to turn a giant heavy windlass, a grueling exercise designed to build core and upper body strength. It is mindless, repetitive, exhausting work. The doctors, the trainers, watch over you with a critical eye. They are often grizzled veterans themselves, men with scarred bodies and cynical souls who survived the arena and now impart its brutal lessons. They carry a verga, a long rod or switch, and they use it without hesitation to correct a sloppy posture or to urge on a flagging novice. A sharp sting across the back or legs is a constant reminder that weakness will not be tolerated. After the initial conditioning, the real work begins. You are handed your training weapons. As a tiro, a rookie, you start with the rudis, the wooden practice sword. It's a clumsy, heavy thing, deliberately designed to be twice the weight of a real gladius. The theory is simple. Train with the heavy weapon, and the real one will feel as light as a feather in your hand. You are also given a practice shield, a scutum made of wicker and leather, also much heavier than the real thing. The first lessons are with the palace, a wooden post about 6 feet high, driven into the ground in the center of the training yard. The palace is your first opponent. You are taught the basic stances, the footwork, how to hold your shield to provide maximum protection while still being able to see. You practice endlessly the basic movements, the thrust, the parry, the slash. The doctor drills it into you. Thrust. Don't slash. A stab wound is more deadly and harder to see coming. A slash looks impressive, but often just cuts the skin. You spend hours, days, weeks, attacking this inanimate wooden post. Tunde. Strike. Kade. Cut. The commands are shouted over and over. Your arm aches. Your shoulder feels like it's on fire. Your shield arm trembles with fatigue. But you keep going. The palace doesn't get tired. The palace doesn't make mistakes. It is the perfect, unforgiving training partner. You are taught to aim for specific points: the head, the throat, the legs. Every movement is broken down, analyzed, and repeated until it becomes muscle memory. This is not the flamboyant, spinning sword fighting of fiction. It is a practical, efficient, and deadly science. The goal is to conserve energy, to expose as little of your own body as possible, and to deliver a killing blow with maximum efficiency. It's a grim, methodical process, like learning a trade. But the raw material you are working with is human anatomy, and the penalty for poor craftsmanship is your own death. As you progress, you move on from the palace to sparring with other novices. These are controlled bouts, still using the wooden weapons. A doctor acts as a referee, watching closely. The aim is not to injure your opponent. He is, after all, a valuable asset belonging to the lanista. The aim is to practice the techniques you have learned, to get used to the rhythm of combat, the feints, the dodges, the sudden explosion of an attack, the sound of the heavy wooden swords clacking against the wicker shields fills the courtyard all day long. It's a constant, percussive beat that defines life in the ludus. The physical toll is immense. Every evening, your body is a landscape of pain, bruises, sprains, muscle tears. You learn to live with a constant level of discomfort. The infirmary becomes a familiar place, where the medicus patches you up with salves and bandages, readying you for the next day's punishment. But the mental toll is just as great. You must learn to control your fear, to channel it into aggression. You must learn to read an opponent, to anticipate his moves. You must develop a kind of fatalistic calm, an acceptance of the violence that is now the center of your world. You are being systematically desensitized, broken down from a man with hopes and fears into a fighting machine. The lanista might stage practice tournaments within the school, pitting his best gladiators against each other. These are major events within the small world of the ludus. There might be a small prize for the winner, an extra ration of food, a temporary relief from the worst duties. These fights are a chance for the lanista to assess his stock, to see who is ready for the real arena, who has the killer instinct, the virtus, the courage that the Roman crowds adored. For the gladiator, it is a chance to climb the internal hierarchy, to earn the respect of his peers and the attention of his masters, to go from being a nameless hero to someone with a reputation, because in this brutal world, a reputation is a form of currency. It can mean better treatment, better opportunities, and maybe, just maybe, a slightly better chance of survival when the time comes to face the real steel under the real sun in front of a real crowd. Let's take a closer look at the brands of gladiator, the different fighting styles that were pitted against each other in the arena. This wasn't a chaotic free-for-all. The Romans, with their love of order and classification, developed a complex system of gladiator types, each with specific equipment, skills, and traditional opponents. These pairings were carefully designed to create a compelling spectacle, a clash of contrasting styles, like a violent and deadly game of rock, paper, scissors. One of the most iconic and recognizable types was the murmillo. If you were a big, strong man, this is likely the role you would be trained for. The murmillo was a heavyweight fighter, a walking fortress. His most distinctive piece of equipment was his helmet, a large bronze affair with a broad, crest-like brim and a visor made of latticed metal. The helmet offered excellent protection, but severely restricted vision and hearing. When you put it on, the world would shrink to a narrow, grated view, and the roar of the crowd would become a muffled, distant thunder. It was hot, heavy, and claustrophobic. The name murmillo is thought to derive from a type of saltwater fish, the murma, and his helmet was sometimes decorated with a fish-like crest. He carried a gladius, the short, stabbing sword of the Roman legionary, about 2 feet long and lethally effective at close quarters. His primary defense was the scutum, the large, rectangular, curved shield, also used by the legions. It was heavy and cumbersome, but when used correctly, it could cover the body from shoulder to knee. His torso was bare, displaying his powerful physique to the crowd, but he wore a thick, padded guard on his right arm, the manica, and a greave, or shin guard, on his left leg. The murmillo's fighting style was based on strength and defense. He was a slow-moving, powerful presence on the sand, advancing steadily behind his massive shield, looking for an opening to deliver a quick, deadly thrust with his gladius. He was the classic heavy infantryman of the arena. His traditional opponents were the thrax, or the hoplomachus, other heavily armed types, creating a clash of steel on steel. But his most famous matchup was against a fighter who was his polar opposite. Let's imagine for a moment you are that murmillo. You stand on the sand, feeling the immense weight of the helmet on your neck and shoulders. You can barely hear. You can barely see. You are a tank. And then, from the other side of the arena, your opponent emerges. He is quick, almost naked, and he carries no shield. This is the retiarius, the netman. The retiarius was the lightest and most mobile of all the gladiator types. He was the embodiment of speed and cunning over brute force. His only armor was a gallerus, a high metal guard on his left shoulder that protected his neck and head, and a padded manica on his left arm. He was bare-chested and bare-legged, relying entirely on his agility to avoid injury. His weapons were unique and terrifying in their own right. His primary weapon was the reet, a weighted casting net, similar to those used by fishermen. The goal was to entangle his heavily armored opponent, to immobilize him, to trip him up. Once the murmillo was caught in the net, helpless and tangled, the retiarius would move in for the kill with his other weapon, a long, sharp, pronged trident called a fushina. If his opponent got too close, he also carried a small dagger, a pugio, as a last resort. The fight between a murmillo and a retiarius was a masterclass in psychological tension. It was a battle of tortoise versus hare. The murmillo would advance slowly, cautiously, his shield held high, trying to corner the retiarius. The retiarius would dance and circle, feinting and dodging, looking for the perfect moment to cast his net. The crowd would watch, breathless. The flick of the retiarius's wrist, the swirl of the net through the air. Would it land true? Or would the murmillo duck in time and charge forward to close the distance? For the murmillo, the retiarius was a frustrating, terrifying opponent. You couldn't just march him down. You were slow and encumbered by your armor. He was fast and unpredictable. The fight required immense patience and discipline. For the retiarius, it was a high-stakes gamble. He had no defense other than his speed. A single mistake, a single well-timed thrust from the murmillo's gladius, and the fight was over. It was this contrast, this drama of opposites, that made it one of the most popular pairings in the arena. The heavy, earthbound warrior versus the nimble, sea-themed fighter. It was a living myth played out on the sand, a story of strength versus cleverness, and the Romans couldn't get enough of it. To counter the unique threat of the retiarius, the Romans, in their endless quest for spectacular matchups, developed a specialized gladiator type known as the secutor, which literally means the chaser or the pursuer. The secutor was, in essence, a streamlined murmillo, purpose built to fight the netman. His equipment was very similar. The large scutum, the padded manica on his sword arm, a greave on his left leg, and the deadly gladius. But the key difference, the crucial innovation, was his helmet. While the murmillo's helmet was ornate and crested, the secutor's was completely smooth, plain, and rounded, almost like a fish's head. It had only 2 very small eye holes, offering even more restricted vision than a murmillo's helm. But this design served a critical purpose. The smooth surface was designed to allow the retiarius's net to slide right off. There were no crests, no edges, no ornamentation for the net to snag on. It was a brilliant piece of practical engineering, a direct counter to his opponent's primary weapon. The fight between a secutor and a retiarius was one of the ultimate grudge matches of the arena. The secutor's job was, as his name implied, to relentlessly pursue his agile opponent. He had to patiently and steadily walk down the retiarius, cornering him, giving him no space to rest or to properly cast his net. The secutor's limited vision was a major handicap. He had to rely on sound and instinct, always trying to keep the darting figure of the retiarius in his narrow field of view. The heat and lack of oxygen inside the helmet would have been suffocating, and a long chase would leave the secutor utterly exhausted. He had to end the fight as quickly as possible. For the retiarius, fighting a secutor was a nightmare. His most reliable trick, the net, was now far less effective. He had to rely on his speed and his trident even more. He would try to tire the secutor out, dancing just out of reach, forcing the heavily armored man to expend precious energy. He might try to use the trident to jab at the secutor's exposed legs, or to get under the rim of the shield. It was a long, draining, psychological battle. The The crowd would follow every move, the slow, menacing advance of the chaser and the desperate, agile dance of his prey. It was a pure distillation of a predator-prey dynamic, stripped down to its bare essentials. Now, let's turn to another classic gladiator type, one whose origins lie in a specific, conquered territory, the Thrakes, or the Thracian. The Thrakes was a tribute, in a backhanded Roman way, to the fierce warriors of Thrace, a region in modern-day Bulgaria and Greece. The most distinctive feature of the Thrakes was his sword, the Psycha. Unlike the straight-bladed gladius, the Psycha was a short, curved sword with a viciously sharp point. This curved blade was designed to get around an opponent's shield, to hook behind it and strike at the back or side. It was a tricky, unconventional weapon that required a unique fighting style. To complement this, the Thrax carried not a large scutum, but a small, square, or rectangular shield called a parmula. This small shield offered far less protection, forcing the Thrakes to be much more agile and aggressive in his defense, actively parrying blows rather than just hiding behind a wall of wood. His helmet was also distinctive, with a wide brim and often topped with a griffin's head crest. Like other heavily armored types, he wore a manica on his sword arm and, uniquely, 2 high greaves that protected both his legs up to the thigh. The Thrakes was often pitted against the Myrmilio in a classic matchup. This was a battle that highlighted the difference in their equipment and fighting philosophy. The Myrmilio, with his huge shield and straight sword, was the Roman legionary. The Thrakes, with his small shield and curved sword, was the barbarian outsider. The Myrmilio would try to use his shield as a battering ram to push the Thrax back and create an opening for a straight thrust. The Thrax would use his agility to circle the Myrmilio, using his curved Psycha to probe for weaknesses, trying to hook around the edge of the big shield. It was a tactical battle, a contest between raw power and nimble aggression. The different types of gladiators were like pieces on a chessboard, each with its own specific strengths and weaknesses. The lanista and the editor of the games would carefully choose the pairings to create the most exciting and evenly matched contests. A fight between 2 identical gladiators was considered boring. The thrill came from the contrast, the uncertainty, the question of which style would prevail. Would the net of the retiarius ensnare the secutor? Would the curved blade of the Thrakes find a way around the Myrmilio's shield? For the men in the arena, this was not an abstract tactical game. Your fighting style was your identity. You were not Marcus or Lucius anymore. You were a secutor. You were a Thrax. Your life depended on mastering the specific skills of your trade, on understanding every nuance of your equipment and every weakness of your designated opponent. You lived and breathed your gladiatorial type. It was who you were, and in all likelihood, it was who you would be when you died. Life in the ludus settled into a monotonous, grinding rhythm, punctuated by moments of intense violence and quiet desperation. The day was structured around training, eating, and sleeping. There was little room for anything else. The barracks, your home, was a place of enforced community. You lived in close quarters with the same men you might one day be forced to fight in the arena. This created a complex and tense social dynamic. On one hand, there were bonds of camaraderie. You were all in the same terrible situation. You shared the same fears, the same pains, the same bleak diet. You might see a fellow gladiator helping to bandage a novice's wound, or sharing a quiet word of advice based on his own experience. There was a shared understanding, a gallows humor that could only exist among men who lived daily with the prospect of a violent death. They were part of a brotherhood, the Familia Gladiatoria, They might gamble together in their off hours, using knucklebones or dice to pass the time and take their minds off their fate. Small wagers, a piece of fruit saved from a meal, a favor owed. These were the tiny transactions that made life bearable. But on the other hand, there was always a current of rivalry and suspicion. The man sleeping on the bunk next to you was your colleague, but he was also your competition. The lanista encouraged this. He might pit you against each other in practice bouts. A victory against a fellow trainee could mean a promotion in the school's hierarchy, moving up from the ranks of the novices, the Tyrones, to the more respected positions. Better treatment, better food, a higher chance of being selected for the less deadly preliminary matches in the games. So you were both brothers in arms and potential adversaries. You might train together, help each other, and then one day find yourself standing on opposite sides of the sand, with the crowd screaming for blood. It was a psychological tightrope that every gladiator had to walk. There was no real privacy. The guards were ever present, ensuring there were no escape attempts, no serious fights outside the controlled environment of the training yard. Your life was not your own. You were woken up, you were fed, you were trained, you were locked in your cell at night. The lack of control over your own existence was absolute. It was a bit like being in a very strict, very dangerous boarding school, or a modern-day high-security prison. The goal of the institution was to strip you of your former identity and remold you into a compliant, effective product. And yet, human nature finds ways to assert itself, even in the most oppressive environments. Men would carve graffiti on the walls of their Celsa name, a crude drawing, a record of their victories. It was a way of saying, I was here, I existed. They might develop their own personal superstitions, a small ritual before training, a quiet prayer to a god from their homeland. These were small acts of defiance, tiny pockets of personal space carved out of a world designed to eliminate them. The relationships between gladiators could be surprisingly deep. There is archaeological evidence from gladiator cemeteries of men being buried together, with tombstones erected by their comrades. The inscriptions on these stones are incredibly poignant. One might read, "To my dearest friend," erected by his grieving brother in arms. These were men who had formed powerful bonds, who saw each other as family. In a world where their own families were lost to them, they created a new one within the grim walls of the ludus. They understood each other in a way no outsider ever could. There was also the constant presence of death and injury. You would see men carried from the training yard with serious wounds. You would hear about a fighter who died in the arena. Every empty bunk was a quiet testament to the brutality of your profession. This constant proximity to mortality fostered a kind of dark fatalism. You learned to live for the moment, because the future was so uncertain. This is why many gladiators, if they won prize money, would spend it quickly on the few pleasures available to them: gambling, extra food if it could be bought, the company of women who were sometimes allowed into the ludus. The fame that successful gladiators achieved could be a strange and intoxicating thing. While still being slaves, they could become celebrities. Their names would be known throughout the city. Fans would follow their careers. They were the rock stars of their day, but rock stars who lived in a cage. This paradox was at the heart of their existence. Adored by the public, but owned by the lanista. Praised for their courage, but stripped of their freedom. It was a confusing, contradictory life, lived in the twilight zone between slavery and stardom, and every day was a reminder of this contradiction. You would train until your body screamed, eat your bland porridge, and then perhaps hear the distant sound of people on the street outside the walls, chanting the name of one of your school's champions. You were at once the lowest of the low and the hero of the hour. It was a strange, impossible life to lead. One of the great paradoxes of a gladiator's life was the quality of the medical care. In a profession designed around inflicting and receiving horrific injuries, the medical attention was, for its time, surprisingly advanced. A lanista was a businessman, and his gladiators were his prime assets. A gladiator who died from an infected wound or a poorly set bone was a financial disaster. It was in the lanista's best interest to invest in top-quality medical care to protect his human inventory. As a result, every reputable ludus had a dedicated infirmary and a staff of highly skilled physicians, or medici. These were not your average back-alley doctors. They were specialists in what we would today call sports medicine and trauma surgery. Their knowledge of the human body of muscles, bones, nerves, and blood vessels was often far superior to that of physicians who treated the general public, and they had a unique and grisly opportunity to perfect their craft. They had a steady supply of wounded bodies to practice on. They saw, on a daily basis, the kind of traumatic injuries that other doctors might never encounter in a lifetime. They became experts in treating sword cuts, deep punctures, broken bones, and dislocated joints. They understood the importance of cleanliness in preventing infection, a concept that was not widely practiced in the ancient world. They would wash wounds with clean water or wine, which has antiseptic properties, and use clean linen for bandages. One of the most famous physicians of the ancient world, Galen of Pergamon, spent several years early in his career, in the 1st century CE, serving as the chief physician to a gladiator school in his home city. He later became the personal physician to several Roman emperors. Galen wrote extensively about his time at the Ludus, and his writings give us an incredible insight into the world of gladiator medicine. He called gladiators' wounds windows into the body, as they allowed him to study anatomy in a way that was otherwise impossible due to the Roman taboo against human dissection. He learned about the function of nerves by observing which muscles were paralyzed when a certain nerve was severed in a fight. He developed new surgical techniques and new recipes for ointments and poultices. He bragged that under his care, only 2 gladiators died from their wounds, compared to over 60 under his predecessor. While that might be an exaggeration, it points to the high level of skill involved. When a gladiator was injured, either in training or in the arena, he would be rushed to the infirmary. The medici would go to work immediately. They would stop the bleeding, clean the wound, and stitch it closed with needle and thread. For broken bones, they were skilled at setting the fracture and immobilizing the limb with splints and bandages. They had a wide array of surgical tools at their disposal: scalpels, hooks, forceps, and bone saws, all remarkably similar to those used today. They also had a pharmacy of herbal remedies to manage pain and inflammation. But let's not romanticize this. The experience of receiving this medical care would have been excruciating. There was no effective anesthesia beyond wine, or perhaps an opium-based draught, which would only dull the pain, not eliminate it. A gladiator would have to lie there, fully conscious, enduring the agony of having his wounds probed, his bones set, or his flesh stitched back together. The screams from the infirmary were likely another common sound within the walls of the ludus, and the goal of this treatment was not simply to heal the man out of compassion. The goal was to get him back on his feet and back into the training yard as quickly as possible. The lanista was paying for his upkeep every day, and a gladiator who was not fighting was not earning. So the recovery period was likely brutal, with pressure to return to training before an injury was fully healed. This constant cycle of injury and recovery took a massive toll on the body. A veteran gladiator's body would be a roadmap of his career, a canvas of scars, lumps from badly healed fractures, and joints that ached with every change in the weather. We can see this in the skeletal remains of gladiators that have been discovered. They show evidence of multiple severe traumatic injuries that had healed. These men endured an incredible amount of physical punishment, patched up by skilled doctors only to be sent out to be wounded again. It's a strange and unsettling thought. These men, who were considered disposable entertainment for the masses, received some of the most advanced medical care of their era. It was a level of care that even a wealthy Roman citizen might not have access to. But this care was not a kindness. It was a business decision. It was the careful maintenance of a valuable, but ultimately perishable, commodity. The doctor's skilled hands were just another part of the machine that prepared men for the sand, another tool of the lanista to maximize his return on a very risky investment. The gladiator's body was not his own. It was a battleground, and the medicus was simply the man tasked with repairing the terrain for the next conflict. Beyond the physical hardship, the daily grind of training, and the ever-present threat of injury, there was the immense psychological weight of being a gladiator. How did a man cope with a life where his survival depended on his ability to harm another human being, often a man he lived and trained with? How did he manage the constant, low-level fear that must have been his constant companion? The answer is complex, a mixture of mental conditioning, superstition, and a carefully constructed professional identity. From the moment he entered the ludus, a novice was subjected to a process of systematic desensitization, the constant, casual violence of the training yard, the sight of injuries, the harsh disciplinate, was all designed to harden him, to numb his emotional responses. He was taught to suppress his fear and transform it into controlled aggression. In the arena, fear could get you killed. Hesitation was fatal. So the trainers would drill into you the importance of virtus, a core Roman value that encompassed courage, manliness, and excellence. A gladiator was expected to display virtus at all times, to face his opponent without flinching, and if defeated, to face death with a kind of stoic acceptance. This was part of the show. The crowd didn't just want to see a fight. They wanted to see a display of character. A gladiator who begged for his life or showed cowardice was despised. One who fought bravely and died well was honored. So the gladiator had to learn to wear a mask of professional calm, to project an aura of fearless confidence, even if his insides were churning with terror. This professional identity was crucial. You were no longer Decimus, the captured farmer. You were Astyanax, the Thrakes, with a record of 10 victories. You belonged to a specific class of fighter, with its own traditions and techniques. This created a psychological distance from the violence. You were not killing a man. You were a secutor defeating a retiarius. It was a job, a deadly craft, with its own set of rules and expectations. This is not so different from how modern soldiers are trained to function in combat. Many gladiators, especially the slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war, were marked with a stigma, a brand or tattoo, often on the face, forehead, or leg. This was a permanent public declaration of their status. It marked them as belonging to the ludus, as being less than a full person in the eyes of the law. This constant, visible reminder of their lowly status must have been deeply psychologically damaging. It was a source of shame, a sign that they could never truly escape their past. And yet, some gladiators may have come to see their scars, both the deliberate brands and the ones earned in combat, as a source of a grim pride. They were marks of survival, a testament to what they had endured. Superstition also played a huge role in the gladiators' mental landscape. The ancient world was steeped in belief in gods, spirits, and fate. The arena, a place of such intense life and death, was seen as a space where the veil between the human and divine worlds was particularly thin. Before a fight, gladiators would engage in various rituals to gain the favor of the gods. The most important deity for a gladiator was Nemesis, the goddess of fate, divine retribution, and balance. She was the one who ensured that pride came before a fall, that everyone eventually got what they deserved. Shrines to Nemesis were a common feature of amphitheaters, often located near the gladiator's entrance to the arena. A fighter would stop here to make a small offaringa coin, a piece of food, a prayer asking Nemesis to grant him not necessarily victory but a fair fight, a chance to prove his worth. He was placing his fate in her hands. There were also countless smaller superstitions. A fighter might have a lucky charm, an amulet he wore under his armor. He might follow a specific routine on the day of a fight, eating a certain food, putting on his gear in a specific order. These rituals provided a sense of control in a situation where he had very little. They were a way of managing anxiety, of imposing a small, personal order on a chaotic and terrifying world. And then there was the hope, however slim, of a future. The ultimate prize for a gladiator was the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized his freedom. The dream of one day earning that rudis and walking out of the ludus a free man was a powerful motivator. It was the light at the end of a very long, dark tunnel. Most men would never reach it, but the possibility, the dream of it, was enough to keep them going through the endless days of training and fear. It was something to hold on to when everything else had been stripped away. The mind of a gladiator was a fortress, built to withstand a constant siege of fear, hopelessness, and violence. It was a place of carefully constructed defenses, professional pride, fatalistic acceptance, ritual, and a stubborn, flickering hope for a life beyond the sand. The night before the games was a strange and surreal affair. It began with the Cena Libera, the free dinner. The gladiators who were scheduled to fight the next day, the munerarii, were taken from the confines of the ludus and put on public display one last time before their ordeal. The editor of the games, the wealthy politician or emperor who was sponsoring the event, would host a lavish banquet for the gladiators. It was a dramatic and jarring change from their usual Spartan diet. Instead of barley porridge and bean stew, the tables were laden with roasted meats, exotic sauces, fine bread, fruit, and free-flowing wine. It was a feast fit for a king, offered to men who were legally considered less than human. But this feast was not an act of benevolence. It was a calculated piece of showmanship. The public was often allowed to attend, to file past the tables and gaze upon the combatants. It was a chance for gamblers to size up the men they would be betting on, to check their physique, to gauge their mood. It was the ancient equivalent of a pre-fight weigh-in, but combined with a bizarre, open casket viewing while the person is still alive quality. Imagine being one of those gladiators. You are surrounded by incredible luxury, the smells of delicious food, the taste of good wine, but you are being watched. Strangers stare at you, point at you, whisper about you. They are assessing you like livestock, speculating on your chances of survival tomorrow. Some might look at you with awe, others with morbid curiosity, others with a kind of predatory glee. You must put on a brave face, a show of confidence and swagger. This is what the public wants to see. They don't want to see a terrified man contemplating his own mortality. They want to see their heroes, their champions, reveling before battle. So you eat, You drink. You might joke with the man next to you, who will be trying to kill you in less than 12 hours. The atmosphere must have been thick with a mixture of bravado and silent, stomach-churning fear. Every swallow of wine, every bite of roasted pork, was tinged with the bitter knowledge of what was to come. Was this your last meal? Was this a final taste of the good life before an eternity of darkness? Or was it simply fuel for the fight ahead, a last chance to build strength for the ordeal? The Roman writers who described the Sina Libera had different takes on it. Some said the gladiators ate with gusto, showing their contempt for death. Others wrote that many had no appetite, that they used the time to give final messages to their friends and family, to settle their affairs as best they could. A man might pull aside a trusted comrade from the ludus who was not fighting the next day and ask him to make sure his prize money went to his wife or children, if he had any. He might dictate a last message, a final goodbye. So the Sina Libera was a study in contrasts, public spectacle and private terror, feigned nonchalance and genuine dread. After the feast, the gladiators were escorted back to the ludus, or perhaps to special holding cells beneath the amphitheater itself. The final hours before the dawn would have been the longest of their lives. Sleep would have been difficult, if not impossible. The wine would wear off, leaving a pounding headache and a raw-nerved anxiety. You would lie on your cot in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the city settling down, knowing that for you, the next day was anything but ordinary. You would run through the fight in your head, over and over again. You would picture your opponent, his style, his weaknesses. You would think about the techniques your doctor had drilled into you. You might say a silent prayer to Nemesis, or to whatever gods you still believed in from your former life. You would think about the roar of the crowd, the heat of the sun on the sand, the weight of your helmet, and you would think about the rudis, the wooden sword of freedom. Was it possible? Could you survive one more time? Could you win, and win again, until you had earned your release? That hope was a fragile shield against the overwhelming fear. It was the only thing that could get you through the long, dark night. The hours would crawl by, and then, finally, you would hear the first sounds of the new day, the stirrings of the guards, the distant crow of a rooster. It was time. The day of the games had arrived, a day that, for you, could be a day of triumph, or the very last day of your life. The day of the games, the dies, Muneris, began with a grand procession, the Pampa. This was the formal entry into the amphitheater, a parade designed to whip the crowd into a frenzy of anticipation. The gladiators were not just fighters, they were the main event, and their entrance had to be spectacular. You would be assembled in the bowels of the amphitheater, in the cool, dim corridors beneath the stands. Here, the air is thick with a unique cocktail of smells. The damp earth, the pungent scent of wild animals caged nearby, lions, bears, leopards, and the sharp, nervous sweat of men. You would be given your weapons and armor, the real things this time, not the heavy training gear. The bronze and steel would be polished to a high shine, gleaming in the torchlight. The weight of it is familiar, yet different. Lighter than your practice gear, yes, but heavy with the knowledge of its purpose. The helmet is placed over your head, and the world outside is suddenly muffled and constrained, reduced to what you can see through the narrow eye slits. You can hear the low, expectant roar of the crowd above, a sound like the sea, a deep, inhuman rumble of 50,000 people. Then, the procession begins. At the head of the Pampa would be the editor of the games, the sponsor, riding in a chariot, dressed in magnificent robes, beaming at the crowd, soaking in their adulation. He is the one making all of this possible, and he wants everyone to know it. Following him are musicians, playing horns, trumpets, and hydraulic organs, creating a blaring, dramatic soundtrack. There are attendants carrying placards announcing the names of the gladiators and the pairings for the day's combat. And then come the gladiators themselves. You march in pairs, in the order you will fight. You are no longer a slave in a gray tunic. You are dressed in your fighting persona. A Thrax in his griffin-crested helmet, a Retiarius with his net draped artfully over his shoulder, a Secutor looking like a menacing, faceless machine. You are meant to look larger than life, like figures from myth, as you step out of the darkness of the entrance tunnel, the gate of life, the Porta Sana Vivaria, and into the arena itself. The sensory overload is staggering. The sudden, blinding sunlight reflects off the white sand, making you squint. The wall of sound from the crowd hits you like a physical force. It's a chaotic roar of cheers, shouts, and insults. The sheer scale of the place is hard to comprehend. You look up at the towering stands of the Colosseum, a man-made mountain of stone and people, stretching up to the sky. You can smell the crowded mass of unwashed bodies. You can smell the hot sand and the perfumed water that was often sprayed into the air to try and mask the inevitable stench of blood. You march a lap around the arena, a circuit of honor, allowing every section of the crowd to get a good look at you. You hold your weapons. You try to project an air of confidence, of deadly purpose. This is your moment on the stage. You are the center of the Roman universe. You would halt before the imperial box, or the box of the editor. Raise your right arm and deliver the traditional salute. The famous line we all know from the movies is, Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor. We who are about to die salute you. It's a fantastic line, full of tragic grandeur, but historical evidence for it is very thin. It's recorded only once, by the historian Suetonius, and it was said not by gladiators, but by a group of criminals and prisoners of war who were about to stage a mock naval battle, a naumachia, and expected to be killed en masse. Professional gladiators who had at least a chance of survival and who saw themselves as skilled athletes likely used a more mundane, professional salute. Perhaps something simpler, like Ave, Editor, a direct address to the sponsor of the games. The romantic, fatalistic version is probably a dramatic invention, but the sentiment behind it, the acknowledgement of the life and death stakes, was undeniably real. After the salute, you would be dismissed, returning to the waiting area to await your turn. The main gladiatorial combats, the munera, were usually the climax of the day. The morning was often filled with other spectacles. First might come the venaciones, the wild animal hunts. Exotic beasts from all corners of the Empirellians from Africa, bears from Germany, tigers from the east would be released into the arena to be hunted by specially trained gladiators called venatores or bestiarii. Then came the grim lunchtime entertainment, the public executions, the noxii. Condemned criminals with no weapons or training would be brought out to be killed, either by wild animals, damnatio ad bestias, or sometimes by other criminals in a crude, forced combat, where the survivor would then have to face a new armed opponent. This was the brutal undercard, designed to keep the crowd sated while they ate their midday meal. You would wait, listening to the roars of the crowd reacting to the slaughter outside. You would try to stay calm, to conserve your energy, to keep your mind focused. And then, finally, you would hear your name called. Your time had come. You walk back down that tunnel, a lonely journey this time, The gate opens again, and you step out onto the sand. The cleanup crews have been at work, raking the sand to cover the blood from the morning's events, but the smell still lingers. Across the arena, you see your opponent, going through his own final preparations. The musicians strike up a tune. The referee, the summa rudis, takes his position. The crowd noise swells to a crescendo, and for a moment, everything seems to fall silent in your mind. There is only you, your opponent, and the vast, sun-drenched space between you. The fight is about to begin. The moment the fight begins, the roar of the crowd and the vastness of the arena should, in theory, fade away. A well-trained gladiator's mind narrows its focus to a single point, the man opposite him. Everything else is a distraction. The combat itself was not the chaotic, 2-minute brawl often depicted in films. It was a tactical affair, governed by rules and overseen by referees. At least 2 officials were present on the sand for a duel. The senior referee, the summa rudis, was often a respected retired gladiator, a man who knew the art of combat inside and out. He carried a long staff, his rudis, which he used to separate the fighters if they became locked together or if there was a pause in the action. For instance, if a fighter lost his shield or helmet. His assistant, the secunda rudis, helped to enforce the rules. This was a professional sport, albeit the deadliest one imaginable. Fights were not necessarily to the death. In fact, for most of the gladiatorial era, death was not the most common outcome. A lanista had invested a great deal of money in training his gladiator, and to have him killed in his very first fight was a terrible business decision. The editor of the games, who sponsored the event, had to compensate the lanista for any gladiator killed, so it was in his financial interest to see men survive as well. A fight could end in several ways. The most decisive was, of course, a killing blow. But a fight could also be stopped due to a serious wound that left one combatant unable to continue. This was known as fighting ad primum sanguinem, to first blood, though this was more common in the early days, or for less important matches. The most common way for a fight to end was with one gladiator acknowledging defeat. The signal for surrender was to drop your shield and sword and raise a single finger, the ad digitum. This was an appeal for mercy, a formal admission that you had been bested. At this point, the fight was over. The referee would step in, and the fate of the defeated gladiator now rested in the hands of the crowd and, ultimately, the editor of the games. Let's go back to the fight itself. Imagine you are the secutor, relentlessly pursuing the retiarius. You move with a steady, grinding pace, your shield held high, your gladius ready. You are trying to cut off the arena, to trap your nimble opponent against the wall. The retiarius dances backwards, his trident held out to keep you at a distance, his eyes constantly searching for an opening to cast his net. The sand kicks up around your feet. The sun beats down on your smooth helmet, and the heat inside is becoming unbearable. Sweat drips into your eyes, and every breath is an effort. You feint to the left, and your opponent mirrors you. You lunge, a quick, powerful thrust of your sword, but he is too quick, skipping just out of reach. His trident darts out, and you catch the prongs on your large shield with a loud clang that vibrates up your arm. He circles again. You can hear the crowd, a dull roar through your helmet, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the fight. Then, he sees his moment. His wrist flicks. The net unspools, flying through the air towards you. You react instantly, as you have been trained to do 1,000 times. You duck low, turning your shoulder, so the smooth surface of your helmet is presented to the net. The weighted edges slide off your armor, and the net falls harmlessly to the sand. This is your chance. Before he can recover his weapon, you charge. You close the distance in 3 powerful strides. He tries to backpedal, to bring his trident to bear, but he is too slow. You smash into him with your shield, knocking him off balance. He stumbles backwards and falls to the sand. You are on him in an instant, the point of your gladius at his throat. He knows he is beaten. He drops his trident. He raises his index finger. He has surrendered. The referee steps in and separates you. You step back, your chest heaving, adrenaline coursing through your veins. You have won. But the drama is not over. It has simply entered its next phase. All eyes in the amphitheater yours. Your defeated opponents, the referee Snow, turn to the editor's box. The fate of the loser hangs in the balance. The fallen gladiator lies on the sand, his life hanging by a thread no thicker than a turned thumb. He has fought bravely, but he has been defeated. He has raised his finger in surrender, and now he waits. The power has shifted from the combatants to the spectators. The entire amphitheater, all 50,000 people, becomes a single massive jury. They begin to signal their verdict. If the defeated gladiator has fought well, shown courage and skill even in defeat, the crowd might call for him to be spared. They will shout Mitty or Mrs. Let him go, or he is released. They might wave handkerchiefs or cloths in the air to show their approval. This was called missio, mercy. If, however, the gladiator fought poorly, showed cowardice, or if the crowd is simply in a bloodthirsty mood, they will call for his death. They will shout, Ugula, slay him, and deliver the infamous gesture, the pollis verso. For centuries, we have imagined this as a simple thumbs down for death and thumbs up for life. The reality is likely more complex and still debated by historians. One prevailing theory is that thumbs up, with the thumb held aloft like a drawn sword, was the signal for death. The signal for life, for mercy, may have been the pollis presso, pressing the thumb down into a closed fist, as if sheathing a sword. Another theory suggests the thumb was pointed towards the throat for death. Whatever the specific gesture was, its meaning was unmistakable. The crowd makes its desire known, a great roar of either approval or condemnation. But the final decision did not rest with the mob. The crowd's verdict was, in essence, a very loud, very public recommendation. The ultimate authority lay with the editor of the games, the man in the grandstand who was paying for the whole spectacle. He would listen to the crowd, gauge their mood. To go against a strong popular opinion could be politically unwise. The games were, after all, about keeping the people happy. If the crowd was baying for blood, it was often easier to give it to them. If they were overwhelmingly in favor of mercy for a popular fighter, granting it would make the editor seem magnanimous and generous. The editor would make his decision and give the corresponding signal. Let's imagine the crowd and the editor have called for death. The victorious gladiator now has one final, grim duty to perform. He must become the executioner. He walks over to his defeated opponent. The loser, according to the strict code of the gladiator, is expected to accept his fate with stoicism. He is not to struggle or cry out. He is to kneel, perhaps grasp the thigh of his victor as a sign of submission, and expose his neck, offering a clean target. The victor delivers the final blow, a swift thrust of his sword into the neck, or between the collarbone and shoulder blade, severing the great vessels and causing a quick death. It is a deeply personal, chillingly intimate act of violence, performed in front of thousands. Afterwards, attendants would enter the arena. One, dressed as Chiron, the mythical ferryman of the underworld, might symbolically tap the dead gladiator on the forehead with a hammer to ensure he was truly dead. Another, dressed as the god Mercury, would touch him with a hot iron wand. Then the body would be unceremoniously hooked and dragged out of the arena through a specific gate known as the Porta Libetinaria, the Gate of Libitina, the Roman goddess of death and funerals. His life, his career, his story, all reduced to a piece of meat being hauled off the stage. But what if the verdict was mercy? What if the crowd and the editor granted missio? The defeated gladiator would be allowed to rise, to collect his weapons, and to walk out of the arena, defeated, but alive. He would exit through the same gate he entered, the gate of life. For him, there is the shame of defeat, but also the overwhelming relief of survival. He returns to the ludus to be patched up by the Medici, to recover from his wounds and his exhaustion. His record will now show a loss, and his value might decrease slightly in the eyes of his lanista. But he lives to fight another day. He will return to the training yard, to the barley porridge, to the endless drills, and begin the cycle all over again. For the victor, the experience is entirely different. He stands alone in the center of the arena, the cheers of the crowd washing over him. He is presented with the symbols of his victory: a palm branch, a laurel crown, and, most importantly, the prize money. This could be a substantial sum, enough to buy luxuries, to support a family on the outside, or to save towards the distant dream of freedom. He is a hero. His name is chanted by the crowd. For a fleeting moment, he is no longer a slave or a criminal. He is the embodiment of Roman virtus, a champion adored by the city. He takes his victory lap, soaking in the adulation, before making his own triumphant exit through the gate of life. He too will return to the ludus, but as a conquering hero. He will be celebrated by his comrades, given better treatment by the lanista. His value has just skyrocketed. He is a star, but tomorrow, he too will wake up in his small cell, a prisoner once more, his body aching, knowing that this victory only guarantees him one thing: the right to do it all over again. The cycle of the arena is relentless. Victory is temporary, survival is conditional, and the crowd is always hungry for more. The aftermath of a fight was a study in contrasts, a world of difference contained within the walls of a single institution. For the victor, the return to the ludus was triumphant. He might be carried on the shoulders of his fellow gladiators, the cheers from the arena still ringing in his ears. He is the man of the hour, the school's pride, the living proof that their brutal training works. His lanista would be overjoyed, not out of any personal affection, but because his asset has just dramatically increased in value. A winning gladiator could command higher and higher fees for his appearances. He was a walking, breathing advertisement for the quality of the ludus. The victor would be given the best of everything the school had to offer: extra rations of food, perhaps some meat, and better wine. He would be tended to first by the Medici. His wounds, even if minor, treated with the utmost care. He was, for now, the school's most precious commodity. With his prize money, he could afford small luxuries. He might bribe a guard for a forbidden pleasure, or use it to gamble with his comrades. He might also save it, carefully hoarding his winnings in the hope of one day buying his freedom, if that option was available to him. His status within the rigid hierarchy of the Familia Gladiatoria would soar. He would move from the ranks of the common fighters to become one of the primi pali, the first swords, the elite of the school. Novices would look up to him with a mixture of awe and fear. He would become a mentor, an example to follow. His name might be scratched as graffiti on the walls of the city. Crescens the Retiarius, 10 fights, 10 victories. He was a celebrity, and he would enjoy the perks of that fame, however limited they were within his captive world. But for the loser who was granted missio, the return was very different. He would slink back into the ludus, not with cheers, but in shamefaced silence. He was alive, and for that, he was undoubtedly grateful on some level. The alternative was a shallow grave in the gladiators' cemetery, but he had been publicly defeated. He had been forced to beg for his life with a raised finger. His pride was wounded as deeply as his body. His comrades might offer some quiet consolation, a shared understanding of what it felt like to lose. But his lanista would be furious. An asset that loses is a depreciating asset. The loser might be punished, given extra duties, poorer rations, or subjected to even harsher training to toughen him up. He would be treated by the same skilled Medici, because he was still an investment worth protecting, but perhaps with less urgency than the celebrated victor. His wounds would be a constant, physical reminder of his failure, and he would have to live with the knowledge that his life had been in the hands of the crowd, that he was spared not by his own skill, but by the fickle whim of thousands of strangers. It was a deeply humbling, psychologically scarring experience. He would have to rebuild his confidence from scratch, to find the courage to step back into the training yard, and eventually back into the arena. His next fight would be fraught with even more pressure. Another loss could seal his fate. The crowd might not be so merciful a second time. And then there was the fate of the man who was not spared. His journey ended at the Porta Libitinaria, the gate of death. His body was dragged to a room called the Spoliarium, the stripping room. Here, his armor and weapons, the valuable property of the lanista, were removed to be cleaned and given to another fighter. His body, now just a naked piece of flesh, was disposed of. There was no grand funeral. Gladiators, being slaves or criminals, were not entitled to the proper Roman burial rites. They were often thrown into mass graves, unmarked and unremembered. However, some ludus maintained their own burial grounds, and fellow gladiators would sometimes pool their money to provide a proper burial and a tombstone for a fallen comrade. These tombstones are one of our most intimate and heartbreaking sources of information about their lives. They give us their names, their gladiator type, their place of origin, how long they lived, and how many times they fought. An inscription might read, "To Flamma, the Secutor, who fought 34 times, won 21 times, fought to a draw 9 times, was granted mercy 4 times. He lived 30 years. His comrades erected this in his honor." These simple stone markers are a powerful testament to the bonds of friendship that existed in this brutal world. They are a final, defiant act of remembering a man who the rest of Roman society considered utterly disposable. They transform a faceless casualty of the games into a human being with a story. So, after a day at the games, the ludus would be a place of mixed emotions. There would be the celebration of victory, the quiet relief of survival, the shame of defeat, and the somber mourning for the dead. The cycle would have completed one more turn. Victors would rest and heal. Losers would try to recover their nerve, and the empty bunks of the fallen would soon be filled by new arrivals, fresh prisoners of war, newly condemned criminals ready to begin their own journey towards the sand. The machine always needed new parts. For a man trapped in the brutal cycle of the ludus, the ultimate dream, the single, shining beacon of hope in a dark world, was freedom. It was not an impossible dream, but it was an incredibly difficult one to achieve. The symbol of this freedom was a simple object, the rudis, a wooden sword, identical to the one he had used for training. To be awarded the rudis was to be granted your manumission, your release from bondage. It was a formal declaration that your service was complete, your debt to society, or your master, was paid in blood and sweat. You could walk out of the gate of the ludus a free man. How did a gladiator earn this ultimate prize? It wasn't just about winning a certain number of fights. The criteria were often at the discretion of the lanista, or could be granted by an emperor or editor for a particularly spectacular performance. Generally, a gladiator had to survive and fight successfully for a period of several years, typically 3 to 5. This alone was a monumental achievement. The average career of a gladiator was short and violent. Many, if not most, did not survive their first few fights. The life expectancy was grim. Most died in their mid to late 20s. To simply stay alive for 5 years in this profession was to beat incredible odds. You had to be not just skilled and strong, but also lucky. You had to avoid a fatal wound, a career-ending injury, or a day when the crowd was simply not in a merciful mood. If you managed this, if you built a reputation as a consistent winner and a crowd favorite, you might finally be brought before the editor in the arena after a victorious fight. Instead of the usual palm branch and prize money, you would be presented with the rudis. Imagine that moment. The crowd roars its approval. You, who entered this world as a chained captive, a condemned man, a piece of property, are now handed this simple wooden sword. You hold it aloft. It is not a weapon. It is a passport. It is the key to a future you thought you would never have. You are no longer a gladiator. You are a rudiarius, a freedman. What did life look like for a rudiarius? It was not always a simple return to a normal life. Many were so institutionalized by their time in the ludus that they struggled to adapt to the outside world. The only skill they possessed was the art of killing. Some would leverage this unique expertise. A famous and respected rudiarius could find work as a bodyguard for a wealthy politician or businessman. His fearsome reputation was a deterrent in itself. Others chose to stay in the world they knew, becoming trainers, the doctors, in a ludus. They would pass on their hard-won knowledge to a new generation of fighters. Their bodies, a scarred testament to their credentials. They had escaped the fighting, but not the world of the arena. And some, in a testament to the strange allure of the gladiator's life, actually chose to return to the sand. The most famous example is a Syrian gladiator named Flamma. His tombstone tells an astonishing story. He was awarded the rudis not once, but 4 times, signifying that he had earned his freedom on 4 separate occasions. And each time, he refused it, choosing to sign a new contract and continue fighting. Why? We can only speculate. Perhaps he was addicted to the adrenaline, the roar of the crowd, the celebrity status. Perhaps the life of a quiet civilian seemed boring and meaningless compared to the high-stakes drama of the arena. Or perhaps, as a former slave, he felt he had no real place in Roman society, that his only true identity was Flamma, the Secutor. His story reveals the powerful psychological grip that the arena could have on a man. It could become the only life that made sense. But for most, freedom was the goal. A freed gladiator was, in the eyes of the law, a Roman citizen, with most of the rights that entailed. He could own property, conduct business, marry, and have children who would be born free. However, a social stigma often remained. He would always be the ex-gladiator. Polite society might still look down on him. His past was written on his body in the form of scars. He could never fully escape the shadow of the amphitheater, but he was alive, and he was free. He could walk down a Roman street without a guard at his back. He could make his own choices. He could watch the sun set without the fear of what the next day's fight might bring. Compared to the life he had left behind, this was everything. The rudis represented more than just freedom from slavery. It represented freedom from fear. It was the end of a long, brutal chapter, and the beginning of a new, uncertain, but precious life. For every man who held that wooden sword aloft in triumph, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands, who died on the sand, their own dreams of freedom turning to dust along with their bodies. The rudis was a symbol of hope, but its rarity was a constant, quiet reminder of the grim reality of a gladiator's existence. To fully understand the world of the gladiator, we have to look beyond the duels themselves and consider the broader context of the day's entertainment. The gladiatorial combats, the munera, were often the main event, the headline act. But they were part of a much larger, day-long festival of state-sanctioned violence. The Romans didn't just turn up for the final fight. They made a day of it, and the organizers provided a full and varied menu of slaughter to keep them occupied. The morning sessions were typically dedicated to the venaciones, the wild animal hunts. This was a spectacle of a different kind, designed to showcase the vast reach and power of the Roman Empire. Exotic and dangerous animals were captured from every corner of the known world and shipped to Rome at enormous expense. Lions and leopards from Africa, bears from Caledonia and Germany, tigers from Parthia, crocodiles from the Nile, rhinos from India. The logistics of capturing, transporting, and keeping these animals alive were a monumental undertaking, a testament to Roman organization and engineering. The venaciones could take several forms. Sometimes it was a simple hunt. The arena would be decorated with rocks and trees to resemble a natural landscape, and specially trained hunters, the venatores or bestiarii, would be sent in to kill the animals with spears, bows, and swords. These bestiarii were a separate class from the gladiators, trained specifically in fighting animals rather than men. It was a dangerous profession, but generally considered less prestigious than that of a gladiator. Other times, the animals would be pitted against each other. A bear against a bull, a lion against a tiger. The crowd would place bets on the outcome, cheering for their favored beast. But the most gruesome form of venatio was the damnatio ad bestias, the execution of condemned criminals by wild animal. This was often the lunchtime show. The condemned, the noxi, were sent into the arena with no armor, no weapons, and no hope. They were tied to stakes, or simply pushed out onto the sand, and the gates were opened to release starving, terrified, and enraged animals. The result was a foregone conclusion, a bloody and horrific spectacle of human beings being torn apart. This was Roman justice at its most nakedly brutal, a warning to the populace of the price of defying Roman law. The sheer scale of the animal slaughter is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. At the inauguration of the Colosseum in 80 CE, the games lasted for 100 days, and the historian Dio Cassius claims that over 90 animals were killed. The Emperor Trajan, celebrating his victory in Dacia, staged games where 11 animals were slaughtered. This relentless hunting had a real ecological impact, driving some species, like the North African elephant and the lions of Mesopotamia, to extinction. The Venetians served a clear ideological purpose. They were a demonstration of Rome's dominion over the natural world. By bringing these fearsome beasts from the wild frontiers of the empire and slaughtering them in the heart of the city, Rome was symbolically taming the wilderness, imposing its order on the chaos of nature, just as it imposed its order on the barbarian peoples it conquered. After the animal hunts and the midday executions, the stage was set for the main attraction. The sand, now soaked with the blood of thousands of animals and dozens of human beings, would be raked over. Fresh sand was brought in, and attendants would spray the air with perfumed mists of saffron and water to try and overpower the stench of death. It was in this sanitized, yet still blood-soaked environment that the gladiators would make their entrance. Their combat was seen as the highest form of entertainment because it involved skill, courage, and human drama. Unlike the helpless Noxii, the gladiators were trained professionals who had a chance to fight back, to win, to survive. Their fight was a display of virtus, of martial excellence, but seeing it in the context of the day's other events changes our perspective. The gladiators' fight was the artistic culmination of a day dedicated to death. The audience was already desensitized, already primed by the morning's carnage. They had seen animals hunted, criminals executed. Their appetite for violence had been whetted. The gladiatorial duel was the sophisticated main course after a crude and bloody appetizer. This context helps us understand the Roman mindset. For them, this was not just mindless brutality. It was a highly structured, ritualized, and meaningful event. It was a reaffirmation of the social and cosmic order. First, you see Rome's power over nature, Venetiones. Then, you see its power over law and order, Noxi. Finally, you see a demonstration of the ultimate Roman virtue, courage, in the face of deathin, the duels of the gladiators. It was a complete ideological package, a powerful piece of state propaganda delivered as popular entertainment. For the gladiator waiting in the wings, the sounds of the morning's events would have been a chilling prelude to his own performance. He could hear the roars of the lions, the trumpets of the hunt, the screams of the condemned, and the roar of the crowd reacting to it all. He knew he was just one part of a vast and terrible machine, a machine designed to satisfy the Roman public's deep and complex hunger for spectacle and blood. As we draw the curtain back from this world of sand and steel, what are we left with? What is the lasting image of the gladiator? He remains one of the most enduring and fascinating figures from the ancient world, a potent symbol who has been endlessly reinterpreted by centuries of art, literature, and film. He is the ultimate paradox, the slave who becomes a hero, the condemned man who achieves immortality, the disposable object who is adored by millions. In him, we see a tangle of contradictions that speaks to the very heart of the Roman psyche. He is a symbol of Rome's power, a living testament to its ability to conquer and subjugate its enemies. The Thracian, the Gaul, the German, all forced to fight and die for the entertainment of their conquerors. The games were a constant, ritualized reenactment of Roman military victory. Yet, at the same time, the gladiator embodies a quality that the Romans themselves deeply admired: virtus, the courage to face death without flinching, the discipline to master a deadly art, the strength to endure incredible hardship. In a strange way, the perfect gladiator was a perfect embodiment of the Stoic ideal, facing his fate with a calm and resolute acceptance. This is why the Romans were so captivated by them. They despised them for their lowly status as slaves and performers, a profession considered deeply shameful for a true Roman citizen. And yet, they couldn't help but admire their physical prowess and their incredible bravery. This deep ambivalence is at the core of the gladiator's story. We see this in the artifacts they left behind. The crude graffiti on a tavern wall in Pompeii, declaring, "Cellidus the Thrax is the heartthrob of the girls." The expensive, finely crafted glass cups engraved with the names and images of famous champions. The small terracotta figurines of gladiators, sold as cheap souvenirs. He was everywhere in Roman popular culture, a figure of both fear and fascination. He was a sex symbol, a sports hero, and a terrifying bogeyman all at once. The blood of a gladiator was thought to have magical properties. It was collected from the sand after a fight and sold in vials as a cure for epilepsy or as a potent aphrodisiac. Brides would part their hair with a spear that had been dipped in a gladiator's blood to ensure a fertile marriage. This speaks to the quasi-religious, superstitious awe in which they were held. They lived so close to death that they were seen as having a special connection to the supernatural world. Their life force was considered powerful, a potent ingredient for magic and medicine. But if we strip away the myth, the celebrity, and the superstition, we are left with the quiet, melancholy reality of the man himself, a man who was, more often than not, a victim of circumstance, a prisoner of war dreaming of the forests of his homeland, a debtor trying to save his family, a slave with no other path. His life was one of monotonous routine, of constant physical pain, of a diet of bland porridge, and of a deep, pervasive fear that he had to learn to master or be consumed by. He lived in a world of profound and violent contradictions. He received the best medical care so that he could be more effectively wounded. He was cheered as a hero one moment and disposed of like trash the next. He formed deep bonds of brotherhood with the very men he might be forced to kill. His existence was a tightrope, walk over a pit of death, and he had to perform on that tightrope with grace and courage for the amusement of others. When we look at the ruins of the Colosseum today, it's easy to be overwhelmed by the grandeur, the scale of the architecture. It stands as a monument to the power and engineering genius of Rome. But if we listen closely, if we let our minds drift back, we can perhaps hear the fainter sounds beneath the imagined roar of the crowd. The lonely clang of a wooden sword against a post in a training yard. The quiet prayer whispered to a goddess of fate in a dark corridor. The inscription on a forgotten tombstone, a final, desperate attempt by one friend to ensure another was not forgotten. The story of the gladiator is not just a story of blood and spectacle. It is a profoundly human story about survival, resilience, and the search for dignity in the most dehumanizing of circumstances. It's a quiet reminder that behind every great and terrible monument of history, there are the countless, nameless individuals whose lives were the price of its construction. And as we leave this world behind and let the sounds of the arena fade into the quiet of the night, we can perhaps carry with us a more nuanced, more compassionate understanding of what it was really like to be one of those men who lived and died for the entertainment of Rome.